Thank you very much, Grosse, for the very kind introduction, and also for inviting me to this fascinating workshop. These are topics I've been working on and we're passionate about. Emerging markets and advanced economies become really much more closely related in a way that the shocks we are facing are now similar geopolitical risks, the climate risks, etc. And that's good to see that these interests are more and more aligned. Speaking of which, a little bit like saying, I would have to take on the goal of inflation target formulations or anchoring of long-term inflation expectations. So these views are all my own, so the usual disclaimer applies, and these are not the views of Dr. Voss or the Eurosystem. So a very brief introduction, why are so many central banks globally today using inflation targeting for the steering of monetary policy? Well,
in the 70s and 80s, there was this very important piece of research that found that there's intrinsic time inconsistencies in making policy for monetary policy makers, and that led to the idea that it's better to delegate monetary policy making to an institution with a clear mandate, because of an inflation bias that eventually policymakers could try to use surprise inflation to increase employment temporarily, which would maybe work over the short term, but the 70s and 80s have shown that over the long run, this leads to higher inflation and less growth. So one solution that seems to be quite well working are inflation targeting regimes where a conservative inflation target is delegated to the central bank. And the benefit of all this is that inflation expectations are better anchored, which lowers the so-called sacrifice ratio, which means that when you like to bring down inflation, you have to sacrifice less growth and employment. So, but that sounds very nice in theory and works very well in models, but practitioners know that for an inflation targeting framework to work properly, it needs more in practice. So, for example, accountability, that the delegated and target is truly enforced, and requires transparency to communicate actively about the policy reaction function, for example, which improves the transmission mechanism because financial markets understand better under certain conditions how the central bank is going to act, and then pricing in more effectively those decisions, which makes it much easier for a policymaker to steer monetary policy stance. And finally, the central bank has to come up with a clear target formulation and its monetary policy and the design of a monetary policy framework. So the talk will be about this question of can there be a link between the design of this target formulation and expectation anchoring, which is what inflation targeting is mainly about. And a quick wrap up, the definition of well-anchored inflation expectations, there's no clear-cut definition, but recurrent criteria pop up in the literature, which harmonizes a bit those ideas around what anchoring properly means. First, that the beliefs are close to the target announced by the central bank. Then it's also about having less or little dispersion of beliefs across agents. It can also be about having little subjective uncertainty where the inflation path is going to settle over the medium to long term. Fourth, it also implies that forecasters and agents in general do not revise very often what they think the medium-term inflation will be, because they have the central bank has credibility and is trusted. And finally, this is almost tautological, but implicit in the previous one, that there is little pass-through from short-run inflation expectations, let's say for the current year, and over the medium to long term, which is called shock anchoring. So I will mostly interpret targeting in my talk as the first definition, like level anchoring, where inflation expectations are close to the target in levels. So coming back to the original idea, like what about target formulations? Isn't that a bit a trivial topic to speak about? But it seems that there is a lot of cross-country heterogeneity and also differences over time. I give you two examples here. The case of New Zealand, which is has introduced inflation targeting as a first country in the world in the early 90s, with a range of 0 to 3% target band initially, then operating for a long period of time with a range of 1 to 3%. And they decided in 2012 to focus on a focal point, on a point target at 2%. A different example is the case of the Riksbank in Sweden. They operated with a corridor and a target for many, many years. Then they abandoned the corridor, operated from 2010 to 2017 with just a point target, and then they decided in a review of their framework to introduce a variational band in 2017. And the South African Reserve Bank also has, of course, uses inflation targeting since February 2000 with a range of 3 to 6% of headline CPI inflation. And since 2017, they focus more, the MPC in South Africa is focusing more on the midpoint of 4.5%. So isn't this the same wine in different bottles all over and different things? No, but actually economic theory tells us that it's not as trivial as you might think. So they come up with predicting conflicting predictions. First of all, coming back to the idea of time-inconsistent policymakers, a very early literature in the 80s was propagating to actually have a very ambiguous target formulation. And that's why you see sometimes the US Fed and also the Euro area, they operated with more like fluffy definitions, but they did not really want to tell what level they really want to target, if it's 2%, if it's something less than 2%, if it's close but below 2%, and you could do some interpretation work here. But the idea behind it, conceptually, was that, well, as soon as you reveal it, it becomes less credible. So that's one view of theorists. A second view is that ranges are more credible because people and agents in the economy will observe the inflation realization on the one hand and compare it to the target. And while it's unlikely that inflation is on target, on a point target most of the time, so this means that implicitly the central bank could be more credible when they come up with a range in the first place. And there are other theories predicting the complete opposite, saying then what if you announce a proper target corridor and you are truly indifferent about all realizations within this corridor, then then you introduce more volatility and you already signal that during specific times you might shift from one objective, which is the inflation objective, to another objective, a subordinate objective, which might be employment, financial stability, or other concerns. And when you give higher priority to those other concerns, that this implicitly loosens the inflation anchor. So in the end, these are testable predictions, and the focus of the paper is to come up with tests, empirical tests of those hypotheses. And I forgot to clarify. Of course, please feel free to ask questions or clarification or for discussions. So more specifically, I use a panel model approach with time and country fixed effects for 29 countries. The observations are running from the second quarter, that's a typo here, of 2005 to 2020. I also now do the update to cover the inflation surge, and the results are robust, but today I'm still presenting the not updated results. And to be able to test these predictions, I have to classify inflation target formulations of those 29 countries and give some homogeneity. I come up with 4 different classifications. First one being no precise numerical target, but more a quantitative definition where how price stability is perceived by a central bank. Then a clear-cut target range. For example, the Reserve Bank of Australia has this thick point of 2 to 3%, the Swiss National Bank from 0 to 2, and the Bank of Israel also has a target band. Then there are hybrid targets where there is either a corridor announced plus emphasis of a focal point, or the other way around, a focal point target with an explicit variation band or tolerance band around. Many emerging market countries use this hybrid target. And fourth, there's a clear point target, such as the Bank of England uses it, and the US Fed before they entered their strategy review of 2020 and came up with flexible average inflation targeting. And I look at the unconditional benefits or differences and conditioning on being persistently undershooting or overshooting the target. But I will be more precise about that later. And to be able to do this, I need a measure to assess the degree of anchoring. And I will propose a new measure, which is focused on this level anchoring based on the cross-sectional distribution of professional forecasters, which is collected by a company called Consensus Economics. So this is proprietary data, which I gratefully can access through Banque de France license. And they come up every quarter with the long-term inflation expectations from 2 to 10 years. And I use those inflation expectations and estimate parametric distribution function. And I obtain a 3D panel in the end, where one dimension is time, it's a quarterly dimension, then the cross-country dimension, and finally, I also have different forecast horizons. All right, main findings are that point targets improve expectations anchoring compared to other targets, and there is less disanchoring in periods of sustained undershooting, in particular undershooting, but also overshooting. So there's and hybrid targets perform very similar compared to point targets, but they seem to be slightly less effective during periods of persistent overshooting or undershooting in preventing that the tails of the distribution of beliefs shift. And I will show also that many of the action goes on in the tails of the distribution and not necessarily in the mean or other central tendencies of the distribution. And to really wrap up the main points of the research I'm presenting today is that point target, that there can be a pecking order or ranking, that a point target only with respect to the anchoring properties could be ranked first, followed very closely by hybrid target formulations where there is a clear reference to a focal point, and these two clearly dominate target ranges. Okay. This relates to the existing literature. I will be very short. There's just 2 papers I know about that really look at differences of target formulations. One is from 2003 and was produced for the first strategy review of the European Central Bank, which started, as you all know, in the late 90s, 1999. And they did not find any significant differences. So the advantage for me was that I had 20 more years of data to ask this question. So I update and extend the analysis. And more recently, Michael Ehrmann from the ECB looked into the question, but using only very short-term inflation expectations over 1 year horizon, where I think anchoring is not really the appropriate word to use, and he finds that there's this. He looks also at shock anchoring and finds that the presence of a range or tolerance band is improving shock anchoring. It also relates to the long-standing literature of inflation targeting as such, whether that helps to anchor inflation expectations. So I come to a more nuanced view and say which specificities can help on that. And more broadly, very long-standing literature on expectation anchoring for central banks. Okay. Just to let you get an idea what kind of data I use, here the paper is more extensive and elaborate about it. I will more focus on the application, so I will be short on how I estimate those parametric distribution functions. Consensus forecasts, like the raw data I obtain, are for each country, and each quarter I get those forecast horizons. But for the long-term forecast horizons, the company decides just to not to give every panelist's answer, but they decide to just give the mean of across all panelists, the highest observation and the lowest observation, so the extreme points, plus the standard deviation. And with these 4 data points, I estimate skew extended T distribution based on the formulations of Jones and Faddy. And this skew extended T is a 4-parameter distribution function, which is very flexible. It shows asymmetry and fat tails. And that's kind of neat and nice as a central banker, where you are concerned to maybe adjust your stance because of tails in the distribution when you think that undershooting or overshooting is getting more prominent, and so I use simulated method of moments approach with 6 targeted moments. I take the mean directly from the raw data, the standard deviation. I get it directly from the raw data. I can target a skewness ratio, which it looks like a bowl skewness definition of the relative distance of the 2 extreme realizations from the mean, which is the mu, the mu here. And then I can target this skewness ratio. And I try to discipline the location of the highest and the lowest observations in the distribution function by having a location constraint, which I estimate using the data for shorter forecast horizons, where I have the full panelist answers. That's a bit complicated and would be time-consuming to explain in detail for this talk, but that gives me a distribution function which I can use as a penalty to more or less locate the lowest at the 3 percentile and the highest at the 97 percentile of the distribution, with some leeway, of course. So that's the intuition of this approach. It gives me a nice distribution function with 4 parameters, and then I can do with this continuous distribution function whatever I want. In particular, I'm going to define a slight, very narrow range around the midpoint of the target, which is this pi star. I subtract 0.1 and I add 0.1 as well, so it's symmetric around the midpoint. May it be a point or a target range, and then I can compute the density below this midpoint or mid-range, which is minus infinity to the lower pi lower bar. And I can also get the risk of de-anchoring due to high inflation, which is the counterpart of all the density above this threshold pi upper bar to infinity. And in the density of all the beliefs of forecasters that just falls in this interval is my anchoring measure. The probability that inflation expectations are on target, and they all add up to 1. So this is a summary of the beliefs of professional forecasters for a country I at time t that in T plus H, inflation will be in this narrow range of the inflation target. And because this is a bit dry, I also come up with pictures, which usually helps. So this is for the euro area, the Q extended T distribution. It's not symmetric. It looks rather symmetric, but it's not. It's on an infinite support of the reals. And this green area is this narrow interval for the euro area. I defined it to be between 1.7 and 1.9, close but below 2%. And you see here that these are, on the left-hand side, are inflation expectations 2 years ahead. They're much more spread out. And it was in April 2020 when the COVID pandemic was just about to start, and inflation expectations were very much tilted to the downside. So there was a huge risk for deflation and undershooting the target. And the counter risk of overshooting was very much contained. However, for the long run, over the 6-year horizon, you see that it's much narrower, the distribution, and the tilting was more to the upside for the same time period, like it's the second quarter of 2020. So this is intuitively the data that I'm going to use. And this is the time series dimension of this data. Before, I just gave you one data point for 2 different forecast horizons. Now I have one forecast horizon, which is the 6-year forecast horizon, so the very long run horizon where people think that inflation should settle, and how it evolves over time. And you can see that much of the dynamics is actually in the tails of the distribution. There was, this is the COVID shock, where you can see that there's a huge tail on the downside, but it was not very persistent. It remained only for even for this one observation, and already in the summer and in autumn, this huge amount of uncertainty went away. However, in the recent inflation surge, the uncertainty in general is higher, but the extreme values are much more tilted to the upside, and some panelists even thought that inflation in the euro area over the very long term could settle above 3%, which is, of course, far away from the target. And if you look at the risk management idea, that you can clearly see that after the European sovereign debt crisis, there was a period of low inflation in the euro area, where this light blue risk of undershooting was quite sizable, and risk of overshooting came close to zero. So there was no symmetry. And then there was as you might know, recalibration of the inflation objective, but also the post-pandemic inflation surge, which led to the tilting to the other side. So this kind of data I'm going to use to give you a rough idea what properties there are. I'm estimating here a simple descriptive statistic where on the left-hand side I have all observations of either the probability to be on target or the 2 risk measures. I add dummies for the forecast horizon. These are the blue betas. I add the volatility of inflation over the last 24 months. So it's a moving average, rolling window volatility measure. I also add regulatory quality from the World Bank World Governance Indicators. I add year fixed effects and country fixed effects and a narrow term, and estimate this using discrete and cry autocorrelation and heteroscedasticity robust standard errors. And what you can see here, let me talk to you with this huge table step by step. Let's first focus on column 4. That's our probability to be on target. And what you can see is that, let's focus first on these forecast horizons. The further you are projecting out, the more likely it will be to be on target. So on average in this sample of countries, expectations have this nice property that they seem to converge back to the target. There's no divergence, but the further out you project, the more you think that shocks have subsided and the central bank was able to take inflation back to its target. So density is converging over the long term. And this is true for the estimated density, but also if I use an unestimated, just a distance of this mean that I get from the raw data from the midpoint. You can see that the regulatory quality is also helping. So when, in general, this country has good institutions, then this anchoring is better, and inflation volatility is usually lowering the degree of anchoring. But here it's not significant. For the other measure, it's significant. I leave it there. We'll not go here to discuss the other results. So now to the main application and the focus of the talk, that we have this I need to come up with a classification of quantitative inflation targets. I do follow the literature and classify these no numerical target, the range target for inflation, hybrid target, which is by far the most frequent, and a point target. And here I come up with these summaries. I show the summary statistics. They do have more or less similar mean inflation targets. So there's no huge systematic difference. While there is that the point target with an explicit tolerance band is used quite a lot by emerging market countries, which tend to have a higher inflation target. So this is slightly above a pure point target, which is at 2.18. And you can see that these target ranges are not very frequent. So there are less observations for the range with the focal point. That's what I wanted to say. Okay. Again, showing this as a plot, we have the advanced economies where you see heterogeneity, that within the group of advanced economies you have point targets, only the red dots. You have target bands like Australia, Israel, Switzerland, and you have hybrid versions from Canada, Czech Republic, New Zealand, Sweden, at least at some point in time. But this is a snapshot in April 2020. In the emerging market sample, you also have all kinds of target formulations. You have point targets in Uganda, Georgia, Albania. These three, unfortunately, are not in my sample because they have very little inflation forecast from consensus. You have many hybrid target formulations and a few bands like in India, Jamaica, or Thailand. So now a first test, coming back to the introduction and the motivation, is to look in such a specification where I have a constant and a dummy for a hybrid target formulation, a dummy for a point target formulation, plus the control of the rolling window volatility of inflation and the regulatory quality in the country I, plus country fixed effects that absorb of all other country specific time fixed effects and year fixed effects. For example, the inflation surge affected all countries more or less in various degrees, extenses of course, and also the global financial crisis led to, as shown by the literature, led to some co-movement across the countries, which are then captured by those year fixed effects. And here I drop now all targets that are just quantitative definitions, and I only focus on clearly defined numerical targets. And the reference group here are all target ranges, and I will explain intuitively how to interpret those coefficients. Now, this is the result estimation tables are also in the paper, if you're interested in the. But these the blue mustache charts here are the results for hybrid, and the red ones are for the point targets. And again, the reference group are target ranges, and the left-hand side variable, this HIT, I plugged in the probability to be on target. And what you can see is that compared to the reference group, which are target ranges, a hybrid target and a point target are more likely that to be on target, or the density of beliefs is much more centered on the midpoint of the inflation target of the central bank. This is increasing with the forecast horizon, but it's also the case for the 2-year horizon, which is more or less believed to be already beyond the usual transmission lag of monetary policy. When the central bank adjusts its policy stance, it requires 6 to 8 orders for those measures to take effect on inflation. So it's already beyond the traditional consensus what the lag in the transmission of monetary policy is, but it's getting more pronounced over the long run. So these are the unconditional effects. And point targets and hybrid targets seem to anchor better inflation expectations. Now, I can also look at the effects on the downside risk or the upside risk. And well, by definition, they should reduce those risks if there's more concentration in the center, but that does not need to be in the symmetric way. And what these results here show are that the hybrid target formulations reduce the upside risk, so seem to limit the right tail of the distribution, the upper tail. Having significant negative coefficients means that the overshooting, that the forecasters are less likely to predict overshooting of inflation, and they are more likely at the same time to predict an undershooting, which for some countries might be good when they want to where they're more facing upside risk to inflation. And for the point target, there's not such a systematic shift in the symmetry of the distribution to be observed. There is still over the short run a reduction in the upside risk of inflation. However, it's not really significant for the downside risk and for the 2-year horizon, and insignificant for the longer horizons. So there's some asymmetry. Now, this is difficult to argue that this is causal, that really the target formulation itself is leading to the change in forecasters' beliefs. And I know the literature, and arguing for causality here is really difficult because there are so many confounding factors and you cannot come up with a laboratory experiment. However, what you can do is to look at local projections, like how did the inflation expectations evolve following a target formulation change, and then you can more or less argue that this change is a bit exogenous to the situation. And then you can more claim that there's a causality running from a change in the target formulation to the outcome of the distribution of expectations. So I estimate local projections, where on the left-hand side, I show the difference, for example, in the probability to be on target from the date t, where the target is changed, and t plus p, which is the evolution of time after the target change. I account for country fixed effects for each forecast horizon. I account for year fixed effects. I'm interested in the effect in the parameter theta after dropping a range target. And I include also the usual controls. Here I have very little observations because range targets per se are less frequent, and they were dropped occasionally only by Czech Republic, Korea, New Zealand, and Thailand. But what the results are quite striking. First, like you to focus on the first two panels, where you can see that the probability to be on target, here on the left, it's for the 4-year horizon, and on the right, it's for the 6-year horizon, are really increasing significantly after the central bank dropped the target range and focuses now more on a focal point. And this is very persistent for more than 3 years. And similarly so for the probability to be on target over the 6-year horizon. This mass is increasing by 0.1 percentage point in a density interpretation, and it's even more for the 4-year horizon. And if you do not believe that much in these estimated density functions and are more interested, have more confidence in the raw data, I also show the results for the distance of the midpoint from the inflation target, from the mean, and you can here see that this distance is lowered. The magnitudes are quite similar. If this distance is lowered, then this implies better anchoring. So there seems to be some scope to call to argue in terms of causality. Okay, I still have some time for the conditional results before I wrap up. So let me explain this next. So far, it was I had some controls, but I did not really focus on situations that are challenging for a central bank. Situations that are challenging for a central bank are when things go bad. So inflation is either too high or inflation is too low. You might not be less familiar with situations that inflation is too low, but in Europe, in Japan, even in the US, we were in such a situation for 10 years almost. From the global financial crisis to the COVID pandemic, and particularly in the euro area, not so long in the US. And then, of course, there are many examples for inflation being too high. To measure this, I follow the literature and compute an indicator which tracks the performance of a central bank by looking at the realization of inflation in country I at period S, and with respect to the target, and look at the quadratic difference. And I accumulate this over 60 months and take the average backward-looking average of this inflation shortfall or overshooting. I do not give much interpretation to this CL. I use the notation from Neunkirch and Tillman, but it's where they refer to it as credibility loss. But it can also, that means that there is really like bad policy. There's a bit of this notion, but it could also be bad luck that economies were hit by persistent shocks or bad, like particularly large shocks. So don't give it much normative interpretation, please, if it's good policy or good luck or bad policy or bad luck. But I can split it into overshooting, CL plus, and undershooting, which makes it then interesting to look at the differences of anchoring properties. So what does this mean? This is more descriptive. You can see here, and again, it's a very rich table. Let's focus on the probability to be on target. These are columns 2 and 3. And it's quite intuitive. When you are significantly persistently overshooting or undershooting, well, you get negative coefficients. Of course, the likelihood that you will be on target is lower. And it shifts the distribution, of course, and it's quite intuitive to, when you're undershooting, you get higher risk of de-anchoring from low inflation. You get lower risk of overshooting. However, for the overshooting risk, well, when you're persistently low, then this reduces, and when you're persistently above target, well, then this increases, of course. So that you can see, this is just capturing the shifts in the distributions. You can see it in the tails, you can see it in the mean, and that's what this table is about to do. And this is worrying for policymakers. Policymakers, when they think of well-anchored inflation expectations, in particular over the 6-year, but also over the 4-year horizon, this is something they don't want. They don't want that out of a sudden, just because you had 2 years or 3 years of low inflation, that people think that it's no longer 2% or 3% or 4.5%. That's something they want to prevent. So let's see if the inflation target formulation is somehow playing a role here. It's and I do this by estimating the following empirical model, where I have again different various measures on the left-hand side, and then I interact the undershooting with the hybrid target and the undershooting with the point target, and also the overshooting with the hybrid target and the overshooting with the point target. And the reference point, the reference group, is then the target range. I also account for the average effect of undershooting and overshooting themselves, and the two controls like inflation volatility and regulatory quality, and year fixed effects and country fixed effects. So now the idea is, do these beta coefficients play out such that maybe the central tendency or the tails of the distribution respond differently when you have different inflation target formulations? And I find I did not even bring those results, but for the probability on being on target, it does not change anything. So, but it changes for the tails in the distribution, which I show here. On the upside, you see the risk of having low inflation, and the risk of having low inflation is for both the hybrid and the point target reduced, which is good for a central bank, but in particular for the point target. And for which countries in the sample this might be a concern? It's of course for those countries that had low inflation. These were the advanced economies before the pandemic, and there it seemed to be better when you had a point target compared to a hybrid target. These coefficients are even statistically significantly different from each other, such that it was really making a big difference whether you had a point or hybrid target. However, for the upside inflation risk, you can also see that they were preventing that tails shift to the upside a little bit, but the results are less significant. And however, the magnitudes are also quite important here. So in general, what I conclude from these findings is that yes, the point target and the hybrid target, they are better equipped of preventing shifts in the tails of the distribution when there are persistent deviations from target. Okay, I do account for a set of robustness tests. Instead of looking at the estimated density functions, I compute the absolute distance or the mean to target. I also look only at the subset of emerging advanced economies and the results they go through. I do look at the subsample without Japan and Turkey, because these countries are known for having a particularly bad track record. And the results that I showed today go through. A different result is sensitive to the inclusion of Turkey and Japan. I haven't talked about it today. I also look at the results without controls, and the results go through as well. And I also drop here dummies and these two, the last two robustness exercises are motivated by the idea, okay, you might even consider that you'd like to see how the track record is when you are indifferent of the environment that you are, without conditioning on the specific environment you are in. So these are even more unconditional specifications. So to conclude, there are debates about the pros and cons of a different inflation target formulation, and these debates are still unsettled, reflecting that this topic is recurrent in central bank strategy reviews. I'm sure that the Federal Reserve will assess the flexible average inflation targeting again. I'm sure that at the ongoing ECB strategy review, they're going to assess again whether they need a corridor or not, etc. So this is really a topic that remains, and also challenges for central bank of disanchoring of inflation expectations. That challenges might not necessarily be symmetric or stable over time. In advanced economies, we had a very long period where we were facing downside risk to inflation. We invented new tools, and the natural rate of interest is still expected to be quite low, although it's a little bit higher now, but the seminal factors driving down the natural rate, and therefore the presence of the zero lower bound or effective lower bound is still there. So whereas emerging market economies face upside inflation risk due to climate change and other supply side shocks, so these challenges remain, and inflation target formulations are an important consideration in my view to confront those challenges. So thanks. And I have a few other questions then later, but I'm really curious now to your remarks and questions.